Today, I'm going to share with you how I was able to unlock the film look with the Sony a6700, the Sony FX30, and the Sony ZV-E10 Mark II. I bought the Fuji X-M5 and I rented the Fuji X-T5 to help me out a bit in this endeavor. To get that more organic filmic vibe I was after, I tweaked a few settings in camera, I adjusted my own shooting style, and I used the two Fuji cameras' color science as a reference point. I've created 5 custom LUTs which were inspired by classic FujiFilm simulations, and you can use these LUTs that I created or use other LUTs that you've previously purchased from somewhere else with these methods. Take a look at this shot. I was shooting in log and using all of the methods that I'm going to show you in this video with the Sony a6700. I shot this with the Fuji X-T5 using the nostalgic neg film simulation. And when I apply the LUT to the Sony a6700, it gets pretty close but leaves enough room for us to make our own adjustments in post if we want to. This method also looks great on skin tones even when we're not in the best lighting environments, only using the interior lighting. You can use this method of achieving the film look with any of these 3 cameras because they all house the same sensor. You can absolutely push your footage beyond that in post-production, but for the most part, I'm shooting and editing with very little color grading using these techniques that I'm about to show you. If you don't have any of these cameras or you're thinking about purchasing one of these cameras or you just want to follow along, I've uploaded some raw project files for you to download so you can throw them into your editors and see how they perform. I'll leave those project files in the description. This video is not being sponsored by Sony or by Fuji. It's not being sponsored at all. These are all of my own methods and my opinions, and I'm just going to share with you what I've learned over the years. But if you like videos like this one, make sure to like this video so I know to make more videos like this one. Normally, I like to go out and try to get that filmic looking type of shot for client work and YouTube videos using the log profiles with my bigger sensor cameras, like the Sony a7S III, which I'm using right now for this headshot. But being able to do that with smaller APS-C cameras really opens up a lot of creative options. I'll show you how to achieve the film look in 6 different parts. First, we're gonna dive into the settings. Then we're gonna turn on log and talk about some of the different things that you have to remember. I'll show you my method for shooting. Then I'll show you how I expose these cameras and then show you some different shooting techniques. And finally, we'll get into color grading for any additional tweaks that you feel like your shots may need. All right, we have quite a bit of information to pack into this video, and that's what we will be tackling today on the Film Alliance. To get that film look, the first thing that we're gonna do is we're gonna jump into our settings. Now, depending on which one of these 3 cameras that you're using, you may see different settings, but they all lead around to the same spot. So you might have to do a little bit of digging, but it's not that hard. The first thing that you have to do is make sure that you have video mode turned on. Then I turn my video codec to XAVC HS4K. And the way I do that is I jump into the menu, I come down to this little video icon, I head over to image quality, and then file format. I click on that, and then I come up to the very top selection, which is XAVC HS4K. This codec records very detailed 4K video while keeping the file sizes manageable. I love this codec because it doesn't fill my memory cards too fast, and also my hard drives afterwards when it comes to storing my footage. However, it's important to note that because it is a 4K file, playing and editing these files may require a powerful editing rig, so you have to make sure that your rig is powerful enough. This is where some of my project files may come in handy because you can download them and see how your rigs handle that footage. Then I switched the frame rates over to 24 frames per second. This will give you a natural looking motion blur. I'll switch my camera over to 60 frames per second if I want to do some slow motion in post-production, but for most of these shots, I just shot in 24 frames per second. I'm gonna get to frame rates by going 1 down to movie settings, and then clicking on the record frame rate, and switching it over to 24 frames per second. The record setting that I use is 100 megabits per second, 420 10-bit. This means that your camera will record video with a rate of 100 megabits per second using 420 color sampling and 10 bits of color depth, aka you'll have more shades of color than you do with 8-bit. Next, I'm gonna set my shutter speed to 1/50th of a second or 1/48th of a second, depending on which one of these cameras you're using. First, you're gonna wanna make sure that you're in manual mode. There's different ways to get there depending on which camera you're using, so you'll have to figure out how to get your camera into manual mode. Then I go to main menu, which is the second one down, and I'll toggle over till I get to shutter speed. Once I'm in there, I'll adjust it until I get to 1/50th of a second. or 1/48th, depending on what camera I'm using. 1/50th of a second shutter speed closely matches that 180-degree shutter rule for 24 frames per second, which will give me a more consistent and cinematic look. Now we are going to switch our Sony camera over to lock. Go ahead and toggle down the main menu until you get to shooting. Then head over to image quality / record. And then you're gonna head down to the log shooting setting. If you see it grayed out, you may have picture profiles set to on, so you'll need to turn picture profiles off. You've heard me talking about log up until this point, and if you don't know what that is, log is like shooting video in RAW mode. It doesn't look great right away, it looks washed out and flat, but it preserves way more color and light information, giving you tons of flexibility to adjust the look of your footage when you go to post-production or you're color grading it. It's perfect for getting the best image quality even in tricky lighting situations. You'll get a lot more dynamic range shooting in log. You don't have to use log for your shots, but just understand if you shoot straight out of camera, like in the standard color profile, you're not gonna get that filmic look that you've been seeing in my shots up until now. You'll have to rely more heavily on shooting techniques and lighting and exposure rather than just using these methods. You can slap my LUTs onto your footage in post-production, or you can manually color grade, which will take more time, but we'll cover both methods once we get to color grading. Now, you have two different options here. You can either shoot in log and then go home and edit your footage, or you can upload LUTs to the camera so that you can actually monitor what the footage looks like in camera, which I find extremely helpful. It's difficult to expose log shots while you're looking at a flat image on your display, but when I upload the LUTs and I can see what the image actually looks like, I'll be able to make sure that I'm exposing properly. Let's say you purchase some LUTs and you want to upload them to the camera. You're going to take out your Sony formatted SD card and you'll plug it into your computer. Once you pull up your SD card on the computer, you may already see these folders, and if you don't, you can create them. But it should look like this: private, and then in that folder, Sony, and then in that folder, Pro, and then in that folder, LUT. Go ahead and copy the LUTs wherever they are downloaded on your desktop into the LUT folder on your SD card. Then eject the SD card, put it back into your camera, and you're gonna jump into your camera's settings in order to import them into it. So go to the main menu, go down to exposure / color, come down to color tone, go to manage user LUTs, and then click on import and edit. And then you can just import those LUTs one by one. Even if you format your SD card after this process, the LUTs will still live in your camera, which is pretty cool. All right, now let's talk about shooting. Now it's time to start shooting, and I'll show you how I expose my cameras to get that film look. If you're just getting the hang of it, or you're in a run and gun situation, you'll do just fine if you leave the camera in program auto exposure. But I like to switch it over to manual exposure to give me a little bit more control over my aperture and my ISO. We have our frame rates set to 24 frames per second, and our shutter speed is set to 1/50th. That gives us two variables that we can adjust when it comes to our exposure. One of those is ISO, and the other one is aperture. Before I talk about that, I'm coming up with an example of either shooting in daylight or low light, because those are the two most common scenarios that I find myself shooting in. But I do tell all of my students in my courses the best time to shoot is either in the golden hour or the blue hour. That's when the sun is low in the sky, not when it's way up and not when it's nighttime. So first we're gonna talk about shooting in daylight. Shooting in daylight often necessitates using the lowest ISO setting to prevent overexposure, because ISO dictates the camera's sensitivity to light. So we're gonna wanna take the ISO down as low as we can go. Now, some people may disagree with this and say that you should be shooting with the native ISO in the camera, but that's not how I do it. I'll explain more about what I mean in a second. The way that I adjust my exposure out in the field is I take my ISO all the way down, my shutter speed is already set, and then I just adjust my aperture. I'll either use the aperture ring on the lens, or I'll use the dial that I have preset in my camera. Now, you could also throw an ND filter on the lens, which will also help you not have to crank up your aperture too high to keep the exposure lower, but just be aware that ND filters will change the color science of your camera's sensor. So you don't wanna go out and use an ND filter for a portion of your shoot and then take your ND filter off for the second portion of your shoot, because when you get to post-production, your colors will not match up. If you do decide to use an ND filter on your lens, which is basically just like sunglasses, make sure to use it for the entirety of the shoot That's just what I've learned from my experience. If I'm shooting in low light, I will use higher ISOs, but I have to be careful that I don't introduce unwanted noise, because the higher you go on the ISO, the more noise that you're gonna get. This is where I implement the native ISOs on all three of these cameras. Before we talk about the native ISOs, shooting with a good lens with a fast aperture, like this Viltrox 27mm f1.2, will let in a lot of light, which means I won't have to crank up my ISO too high. As a good threshold, these three cameras have 2 native ISOs. A native ISO on a camera is the sensitivity setting where the sensor is going to achieve the optimal signal to noise ratio without any digital amplification. The 2 ISOs that I aim for when I'm using either or any or all 3 of these cameras is 800 or 2500. So in a super low light situation, I'll switch my ISO over to 2500, and then I will use the aperture ring on the lens to get the proper exposure. If I'm in a low light environment, but it's not too low light, like the sun's still a little bit up in the sky, I'll throw the camera into ISO 800, and then I will use the aperture on the lens to adjust for exposing. But you may be wondering, well, how do we have a gauge of what the proper exposure is? That is a great question, and it leads us to part 4, exposing. There's an endless list of different ways that you can expose your cameras when you're shooting in log, whether that's using the histogram or zebras or false color or exposing to the right, and I've tried them all, and at least up until now, this is the easiest, fastest, least amount of work way to do it, in my opinion. And it's super simple. Just keep your exposure compensation meter at or below 0.0. Now, not too far below, maybe like negative 0.3, negative 0.7, but anywhere in that range I found works great. I never overexpose with these cameras, never go to plus 0.3 or plus 0.7. I always stay at or below 0.0. I'm telling you this from a standpoint of using log a lot, and this method has always been the easiest for me. The results may not be perfect like a Netflix documentary, but they definitely get the job done, and I personally think they look great. You can always bring your exposure up in post-production, that's why I say at or below 0.0, but you can't bring your exposure down in most cases, especially if your shot is already clipping. But even bigger of a variable than exposing is locking in your white balance. For many years, I shot making sure that all of my exposure was correct, but a lot of times, even with my log shots, I would get home and the clips did not match up back to back, and I could never figure out why until I started locking my white balance. When I started locking my white balance, there was no variable in the camera deciding on what the white balance should be, and all of my colors started to come together clip to clip. It made such a big difference. So make sure to lock your white balance. A lot of how you choose to use these methods will come down to what you're trying to shoot. If we're doing a client shoot, then we're gonna wanna pick a film look that goes with whatever the brand or style is that the company is trying to achieve. The 5 different LUTs that I created could be used for different purposes, so try to envision your preferred shooting style and then go with that color preset. Another thing that I do is I set up the grid to make sure that I'm framing my shots up correctly and the composition is looking decent. But a bigger piece of advice that I have for you is making sure that your horizon is level. That way you're not having to scale in post-production and rotate the shot, because then you'll be losing out on a lot of valuable resolution. One pro tip that I have started to do in the past, I don't know, few years is let the camera be still and let the subject do the moving. Too many times I was moving my camera trying to make the shot look good and give it a little bit more movement and have motivation behind it. But lately I've just been sitting still and letting the camera get the shot, let the subject move, and a lot of times that makes a very good looking cinematic shot. So I just like to calm down and let the subject do the work. All right, let's talk about color grading. Log footage is flat. And some people say that they like the look of logs straight out of camera, but I personally like to color grade all of my shots, whether that's manually, like with my color wheels, or dropping in custom LUTs into Final Cut Pro. I happen to use Final Cut Pro. I'll drag my footage into the timeline, and then I'll either apply the LUT into the video, or I'll color grade manually, like I had already mentioned. The way that I apply the LUT to the footage is like this. If I go over to the effect panel, I'm gonna go over to color, and then I'm gonna drag custom LUT over to my log shot. Once my custom LUT is in the clip, I'll come over to this little film icon, and you can see that I have a custom LUT box that is highlighted with a yellow bar. I come to this drop-down menu inside of the custom LUT box, and then I'm gonna come down to the bottom where it says choose custom LUT. I'm gonna find the LUT wherever I downloaded it to my computer, and then I'll press open. You'll have to do this for each LUT. Now that we have the LUTs imported, we can click the little drop-down menu again and pick which LUT we want to apply to the clip. Then if I want to adjust it further, maybe I didn't get the white balance right or the correct was off a little bit, I'm gonna go back into the effects and drag color wheels into the clip. Then I'll drag the color wheels section above the custom LUT and start color correcting from there. Then I just copy these two effects, custom LUT and the color grading wheel, to every single clip in my timeline. And then I'll just go through each clip and I'll adjust each one to make sure they're all matching up correctly. The LUT really just gives us a baseline and the color wheels are for minor adjustments. If you were trying to do this without the LUTs, then I would use the color wheels and I would adjust the exposure, the shadows, and the saturation until I got the look that I wanted. And there's also several other color grading tools that you can use to get your shots to look the way you want to. I just prefer to use these LUTs because they're already built and you can drag and drop them right into the clip. I've discovered that getting the film look with the Sony a6700, the FX30, or the ZV-E10 II is absolutely within reach, even with their smaller APS-C sensors compared to full-frame sensors. It's really about dialing in the settings, getting comfortable with log shooting, nailing your exposure, and using some of the shooting techniques that I've taught you in this video. I found that using the FujiFilm X-M5 and the FujiFilm X-T5's film simulations gave me a great baseline to develop a custom film look. And whether you use my LUTs or your own LUTs or someone else's, the real trick is understanding how to get the exposure right in camera and then tweak the footage in post to get it to look exactly how you want. The ability to upload LUTs and monitor your LUTs directly into camera is a huge advantage. It just makes the whole process so much easier and smoother and ensures that you're getting your exposure correct. I also learned that focusing on practical shooting techniques like keeping the camera steady and letting the subject move really emphasizes thoughtful composition and natural motion. If you take the time to learn and implement these steps and practice, you'll be able to confidently capture and refine your footage, whether it's for client work or YouTube videos or personal projects, whatever it is that you're doing. And if you're a little bit nervous about shooting with log footage, just go ahead and use Program Auto until you feel comfortable enough to jump into manual exposure. Also, don't forget that you can download some of the footage that I made available so you can practice with your editors. Maybe you want to take that footage and then compare it to your footage and see if you can get it to match up as far as exposure goes, and then also color grading it as well. My final message to you is go out there, experiment, and unlock the cinematic potential of your Sony camera. You'll be amazed what you can achieve with these small little guys. Thanks for watching. I'm Joe, and this is the Film Alliance. I'll see you on the next video. One of the most asked questions that I receive is, which camera should I buy? I know that you want to make the right decision, and it's a big decision. You want to find the camera that best suits your needs and stays within your budget. Many of you know which camera might be for you, but you need some guidance pinpointing it and feeling confident in your decision. That's why I made this course. I want to put my camera experience and knowledge into a compact and easy to follow format. I jam-packed it with camera buying fundamentals that I guarantee you will carry through the rest of your camera journey. I based this entire course on all the things that I wish I had known or someone had told me when I first started out. From understanding different camera types and their features to matching them with your specific video and photography needs, this course covers it all. After finishing, I'm confident that you'll finally have clarity over every angle and aspect that you might consider when buying a camera. I'll guide you through my entire camera buying process, taking you 90% of the way there. That way you'll be well prepared to make your decision. This is essentially all the guidance that I would give my own brother if he asked me, "Hey Joe, which camera should I buy?" Now I'm going to share that insight with you.